In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what I consider a sub-technique within Euro nymphing, and that is floating your cider. One of the things I always try to do as an angler is fit the best technique to each water type that's in front of me. I'm always evaluating different techniques, different leaders, different rigs that I can use in different water types to see which technique works best given the conditions and the water type and the time of year. One of those techniques that I've been reevaluating over the last 6 or 7 months is floating the cider. As I've revisited floating the cider, I've found some water types that it works as well or better than any other technique that I've used. In these experiences, I always think back to my times fishing with Pat Weiss, my teammate from Fly Fishing Team USA. Pat is absolutely deadly with this technique. Many of Pat's home waters are lower in gradient, and floating the cider works exceptionally well in those water types. The improvements that I've personally made in fishing a floated cider have come mainly through watching Pat and trying to emulate him over the years. So why is floating the cider different than any other style of Euro nymphing presentation? When most anglers think of Euro nymphing, they think of using a high rod angle and enough tension in your leader that you form a tent shape between your rod and your cider with your cider off the water. And that forms what a lot of people just call a tight line connection, where you have a direct or mostly direct connection to your flies down under the water, and you're watching that cider above the water to see any indications of a take from a fish. When you're fishing a floated cider, you're reducing that tension in your leader just enough that your cider can sit on the water and form what is essentially a weak suspension device. So you grease that cider so that it floats. Your floated cider is now like an indicator or a dry fly, and that's your pivot point or your mediator between your flies and your rod tip and helps control your drift. The other thing about floating the cider is that it's usually done directly downstream or just barely off to any one angle. So if you're approaching fish in shallow water, smooth water where they tend to be spooky, then floating the cider is a really good technique to use in this water, where you can stay out of that fish's field of view, behind them in that blind spot, and you don't have to worry as much about spooking them. In a lot of the water where it works best, if you were to use a traditional Euro nymphing approach from the side and make an up and across presentation, you're going to either spook fish or need to crawl and get on your knees to have any chance of fishing to those fish without spooking them. A floated cider doesn't have the buoyancy of a dry fly with a whole bunch of buoyant materials or an indicator, so it can't float your flies indefinitely. And there is a limit to the weight that you can use on this rig. You can fish flies up to about a 2.8 millimeter bead on this rig and still be able to float your rig far enough to get a long enough drift to be successful. If you have to go to a larger bead size than about a 2.8 millimeter fly, then you can float your cider usually for the beginning of your drift, but then the rest of it is going to sink and you need to move into a presentation where you hold your cider off the water. But that transition has to be done really delicately and smoothly with a lot of finesse and control in order to make that transition without affecting the drift of your flies. What type of water does floating the cider work in best? I like to use this technique in water that's shallow, maybe even inches deep sometimes, up to about 3 feet of depth, and slow to medium speed. It can't be stagnant and it can't be too fast. If it's stagnant, you're better off fishing a dry fly or a yarn indicator to suspend your flies indefinitely and hold them up. A floated cider simply can't suspend your flies forever. But if it's really fast, then you generally need to fish too much weight to be able to get down quickly to be able to float the cider. So it fits in that narrow world of smooth to slightly bumpy water and shallow to about 3 feet deep. Tailouts, glides, shallow riffles, places like that work really well with a floated cider. And look for areas of the water that aren't super complicated. What do I mean by that? It's not a great technique for eddies, especially small ones, or pocket water. It's not a great technique for very complicated areas of the river where you have hard seams that define the difference between slow and fast water. The reason is if you land your flies on one side of that seam in slow or fast water, they're going to fight against the drift of your cider, and you're going to end up having drag and loss of strike detection. But if you have water that's not complicated, water that is uniform more or less from bank to bank, or at least doesn't have hard seams that delineate that slow to fast water, then it works really well in those water types. And the nice thing is those water types happen to be places where a traditional off the water cider approach tends to not work as well. So this is a way to fill in the gaps of different water types that don't work with the traditional Euro nymphing approach. When fishing a floated cider, you need to fish directly upstream or maybe off 20 to 30 degrees to one side. The floated cider floats on top of the water, not in it like a dry fly or an indicator. So this means that you can't mend your leader without moving that cider around, and it makes it a poor choice to fish across the current. But if fished upstream, it has less interaction with those surface currents, and it tends to provide an even better drift than a dry fly or an indicator would in the same water, as long as you can approach from downstream. In the last several years, I've talked a lot about fishing a micro leader, so a leader that has a very small butt section diameter of around 4x. Micro leaders don't really work with a floated cider. They simply don't have the diameter or the surface area to be able to grease and suspend your flies for any length of distance. When floating the cider, I tend to fish a leader that has a cider diameter of at least 0.012 inches. So if you're 1,000th either side of that, you can probably get away with it. But 0.012, 0.013, somewhere in there is a good starting point for a cider diameter that's thick enough that when greased, it can suspend your flies for at least a little distance. If you're looking for a leader that you can buy out of a package and use for this technique, the tactical fly fisher leaders that we sell on the site will work well for it. But one of the things that I've tried to do is make a leader that I can still hold off the water with the least amount of sag possible to get close to a micro leader if I do need to, in a couple of spots, make a cast where I cross currents and hold my cider off the water. To make a leader that works well when held off the water and floating the cider, start with something like 14 feet of cider material. That can be bicolor, or in really clear, spooky water, I like to use opaque white. Near the end of that 14 feet, before you hit your tippet ring, you can tie extra knots. I use blood knots with 6 or 7 or 8 turns that are bigger so that they grab extra grease. And those little knots make extra suspension devices or micro indicators within that part of the cider to help hold on to grease and suspend your flies a little easier. If you want to reduce your weight even a little bit more on the terminal end of that cider, you can use a micro perfection loop instead of a tippet ring. If you're new to fishing upstream with a floated cider, and especially to tuck casting, you may still want that leader that has a little more stiffness in the butt section to help with the cast. But as you practice and get better, you can reduce the diameter of that butt section to help you reduce the sag and therefore improve your drift. I generally fish a longer tippet when floating the cider than I would with cider held off the water in the same depth. The tippet angle between your cider and your flies can't approach vertical without sinking your cider. You need to have enough tippet between your cider and your flies so that your tippet doesn't go past a 45-degree angle between your cider and your flies during the drift. What does that mean? You need to have tippet that's probably at least twice the depth of the water that you're fishing, but maybe even a little bit more. When floating the cider, I use more of a traditional overhead cast, and I often use a tuck cast, which we've already done a video on here. My casting shape tends to be a little less oval than when fishing up and across. You need to be able to cast over either shoulder to match the side of the river that you're on and to avoid overhead obstructions that you might find along the way. Again, in shallow water, you might want to land your cast with more of a horizontal trajectory so that you slow the sink rate of your flies. But in deeper water or faster water, you may need to use differing degrees of a tuck cast to increase the sink rate at the beginning of your drift and get your flies where you need them to be in the column. When setting up your drift with a floated cider, you want to ensure that your flies and your cider land in as close to the same speed of water as possible. If you need to, reposition yourself so that you're directly downstream of where you're trying to cast. That will put your flies and your cider in the same stream of current and hopefully give you the best drift. After you've made your cast, keep your rod high and extended away from your body. If you make your cast and then pull your hand back in towards your body or drop your rod tip, that's going to affect the amount of slack that you have outside your rod tip and thereby affect your drift. One of the big challenges of fishing this technique is managing your slack. When I've tried to teach this to people in the past, they manage their slack in such a way that they're jumping their sider around all the time. They either pull in too much slack and it pulls their flies downstream to them, or they don't pull in enough slack so it coils up and you end up getting a bad drift either way. You need to watch your sider very closely and pull very smoothly, either with a long, slow strip or a little bit of a hand weave and maybe a strip at the same time. And make sure that you're not making any little micro wakes with the knots in your sider that indicate that you're pulling your sider downstream too fast or not fast enough. The entire point of floating the sider is to try and get the best drift possible, so your slack retrieval needs to be done in such a smooth way that it doesn't affect the drift of your flies. While drifting your sider, try and keep as much of it off the water as possible. Generally, at the end of my drift, I have probably about 6 to 8 inches of the sider on the water. But when you first make your cast, you may have around 2 feet of it on the water. As it's drifting towards you, the natural steepening of the angle between your rod tip and your sider will remove sider off the water if you've matched the current speed with your slack retrieval. Depth adjustment is pretty much the same as any other method of Euro nymphing. And we've already done several previous videos on this to help you, so you can find them in the video description below. When it comes to adjusting your depth when floating the sider, you can cast further upstream, you can use a tuck cast or a horizontal cast, you can increase or decrease the length of your tippet, increase or decrease the diameter of your tippet, and adjust the weight and the profile of your flies. When floating the sider, you don't have a downshift in the drift like you would with your sider off the water, so the best indication of whether you are in the zone or not is ticking near the end of the drift. I tend to like to tick the bottom more often at the end of my drift than I would with a sider held off the water, so that I can know whether my flies have reached that zone in the boundary layer near the bottom. If you look around online, a lot of anglers I know are still trying to feel their takes when Euro nymphing. In my opinion, this isn't the best even when holding your sider off the water, but when it's on the water, it's impossible. You're not going to feel a take. Everything has to be seen visually. Look for the subtlest indication that something has gone different with your flies than just drifting along. So look for extra tension in the leader that you didn't expect. Look for your sider to jump forward a few inches, just to slow down. Look for that tippet that was kind of floating in front of your sider to abruptly sink all of a sudden. Subtle indications like that can mean a take. And it's that subtlety, but also that sensitivity that makes the floated sider so deadly when fishing in flat water. So now that I've talked a little bit about floating the sider, how we do it, what it's used for, let's go put its use on the water. I've got a glide in front of me here, and the surface currents are just slightly bumpy. It's not super smooth, but it's the perfect type of place to do some floating of the sider. I have really shallow water. Kind of the edge of where I'm standing is on the edge of a little bit of a trough here on just barely to my right. So I'm staying out of the trough just a little bit to try and not spook as many fish, but I'm casting upstream and fishing that little bit of a trough or depression down the right side, or my right side of the glide here. And then I'm probably going to avoid this stuff on it's directly in front of me. There are fish that get into here at other times of the year when the water's warmer, but it's late January. The fish are pretty much concentrated in this deeper, slower part of the glide right now. So let's do a little bit of floating the sider in here. I have, I don't know, I've got my Euro line is right at the tip of my rod. This is a 10-foot 3-weight here. So that leader is about 20 feet long. So I've probably got about 20 feet of line beyond my rod tip, which means with a tuck cast here, I might be casting 25 feet at the most. So I'm making a tuck cast, getting those flies down, or trying to get them down early in the drift so that they drift nice and smoothly near the bottom, at least in that lower part of the column. And a couple casts in, nice big brown here. Looks like it took the perdigon on the dropper. Now I've got from the sider to that fish, which is on the dropper tag, I've probably got 3 feet of tippet. This is a fairly shallow spot here. I mean, it might get a little bit over my knees at the deepest there. So the water might max out at around 2 feet deep, but I've probably got at least 4 feet of tippet on to my point fly. So I'm going at least twice the depth of the water, maybe a little more. And I've got 2 millimeter beads on both the point and the dropper. Ooh. That's a toothy brown trout right there. Gonna have to be careful getting my perdigon out. All right, so nice later winter post-spawn brown trout here that I just got. A couple of casts in. He ate a diabetes perdigon on the dropper, just a little size 20 with a 2 mil bead, and then I have a 2 millimeter beaded blowtorch on the point as well. Okay, let's get back in there. Again, I'm just making sort of short to medium range tuck casts, trying to stack a little bit of slack. At the beginning of the drift there's another fish. And looks like this one took the blowtorch on the point. All right, nice 10-inch brown trout or so. So after I make that cast, tuck cast, I'm just letting it settle for just a second, and I'm hand weaving my slack back to me. If the speed of the water was a little quicker, I'd probably just make a pull in addition to the hand weave, but I don't really need to do that because it's not quite fast enough. I can also just make one long pull in here, a big long strip, if that's easier to be smooth for you. The important part is being smooth. I'm trying not to affect the drift of my sighter at all. I'm looking at it, and if my slack retrieval all of a sudden shows extra tension in the sighter, there's a fish, little guy. So as I'm making that slack retrieval, I'm looking at that sighter. I'm really paying close attention. There's a lot of fish in this spot. Yeah, big old jump on the sighter. All right, as those flies are coming back towards me, I'm looking at that sighter, and if I start to get any sense of it dragging, so if I see any little micro wakes on those knots as I'm pulling them towards me from my slack retrieval, then I know I'm retrieving too fast. I want to retrieve that slack in a way that, see you later, brown trout. Hello, ducks. Dang, some fighter jet mallards right there. But I want to retrieve that slack in a way that my sighter is just floating on the surface of the water exactly at the speed. It's more or less, it's not coiled on the surface. There's not a ton of slack, but it's also not getting pulled downstream towards me slightly faster than the current. It takes a little bit of practice for a lot of folks to understand when you're getting that drift correct. That's the hardest part of this for most people, is understanding how to manage that slack in a way that doesn't affect the drift. You'll see my rod is staying in the same position. I'm not lifting up. I'm doing all my slack management with my line hand. So I'm stripping or hand twisting that slack as it comes back to me. And keeping my rod tip more or less in the same place. Now, what am I looking for as far as the strike detection goes? In this spot, several of the fish jumped that sighter forward that I've caught, so it's been pretty obvious. And because the currents in this spot are just fast enough and not complicated enough, that's probably pretty typical. It's not a very deep spot, so the angle of the tippet is going to be not very vertical below the sighter, and so when a fish takes, it is likely to just kind of stop or jump back upstream, and that's what's happened. But I'm also watching that sighter, and if it sinks sort of unexpectedly, like goes from floating to an abrupt sink, I'll set the hook. If it just stops, hesitates, slows down unexpectedly, I'm really just looking for any sort of difference in the drift that's not being caused by me. So I'm, you know, there's a little guy. So that one was just barely a hesitation, small hesitation. The sider was coming along, and I actually watched the tippet in front of the sider beyond it hadn't quite sunk yet because I didn't really tuck cast that one. And all of a sudden the tippet sunk quickly and the sider just slowed down. That's all I saw. That wasn't a very obvious eat that time with that fish. So you just have to pay attention to real small details sometimes in the drift of that sider. Is it doing anything that you don't expect it to do? Like that. So that one was bottom. I actually got some leaves back, but it stopped or just kind of went forward. You're basically looking for drag both ways. You can induce drag downstream by stripping too much or raising the rod too fast and accelerating those flies downstream. Well, it's the same thing, but in the opposite direction if a fish takes your fly. If your rig's drifting along and all of a sudden you get what looks like upstream drag where it goes back away from you, and that's a good cue to set the hook. Thanks for watching this tactical fly fisher video. Hopefully it helped you understand a little bit more about floating your sider and where it works best. If you need a little bit of grease to float it or some indicator material to help build that leader, come on over to tacticalflyfisher.com, where we've got whatever you need for your next on the water floated sider adventure.